Great, so we'll just make a start. Thanks everyone for coming. Sorry if there's any confusion around the start time. Just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Chloe Van Grieken. I'm an architect at Hoskins Architects in Glasgow, and I'm a member of ACAN Scotland. So we're kind of volunteer organisation, just trying to do a little bit for the climate in the built environment. So obviously the built environment is a massive contributor to climate change and biodiversity loss. But I personally believe that working in this sector, we have a huge opportunity to make positive change. We need to be realistic but optimistic about what we can do when we use our collective agency. So the goal of this event series, which was kicked off with a sister event in Edinburgh last week, is really just to spark some conversations amongst all of the really talented individuals in this industry about how we can kind of tackle this in Scotland. So we've got a really exciting evening ahead. We've got a fantastic keynote talk coming up, and then also some opportunities to everyone to get involved and help shape the future of the organisation. Please join us after the event for drinks in the Vic Cafe just around the corner. And just to let you know, the event is being recorded. So if you need to speak to anyone about permission, photographic permission, just speak to one of us with a wee badge on. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to our three speakers. So I think most people here will know Barnabas Calder through either his work at Strathclyde or hopefully you've come across his previous work. His book is here on the lectern. I was really fortunate to have Barnabas as a tutor quite a number of years ago, and that was a big influence on my personal early architectural career. For those of you who don't know Barnabas's work, he is an architectural historian at the University of Liverpool, and he specialises in the relationship between architecture and energy throughout human history, which is just a tiny little topic to be getting on with. We also have Florian Urban here, who's the head of history of architecture and urban studies at GSA, and he's also written extensively about housing, architecture and urban design. And John Burns as well is an architect and associate at Holmes Miller in Glasgow. Sustainability is a key part of his work, and he authored Tenement, an Architectural History, which is published by the Glasgow City Heritage Trust. So massive thanks to the three of them for being involved, giving up their time to come and talk today. It's really, really appreciated, especially to Barnabas, who's travelled from England despite the disruption. I'd also like to thank the ACAN Scotland volunteers for their efforts putting these two events together. Also to GSA for hosting the event for free and all their assistance and support, especially at a time year-end when there's other deadlines and pressures. And we're also collaborating with the GIA. So thanks to them for their funding and support. And I'm just going to hand over to Siobhan and Kieran, who are going to talk briefly about GIA before we get started. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Chloe. As Chloe said, I'm Siobhan McGill. I'm a senior architect and passive house designer at East Ayrshire Council. I joined the GIA about 2 years ago, really because probably I'm passionate, probably in the same level as everybody is here today, about sustainability and how I could contribute back to the industry. So really, the GIA, if a lot of people don't know about it, is one of the largest chapter areas of ReEnergise. It covers Glasgow, it covers Ayrshire, Baste, Dumfries and Galloway. So we have a large membership and representation. One of the key things we wanted is this collaboration is to reach out to people to join and get involved in the GIA. Kieran and I are both part of the Sustainability Committee, and I joined right off the back of just COP26, and there was a lot of energy happening around about that time. But we felt that we needed a refocus, and pretty much the conversation of tonight is a refocus. So for the past 2 years, we've really been trying to develop that and developing sustainability talks and tours. So really, we just say follow us on the Instagram for events that we're trying to collaborate with. This is our first collaboration with ACAN. So I'm going to hand over to Kieran to just highlight the key areas the Sustainability Committee is trying to promote.
Thank you. I'm Kieran. I'm an architect in Glasgow at Stalin Brand Architects, and like Siobhan, been involved in Glasgow Institute of Architects sustainably for a couple of years, and then over the last 18 months been involved in ACAN. So I kind of straddle the two groups, and have been really quite fortunate to collab with quite a lot of really talented people in both groups to try and make tonight's event possible. My kind of like MO, what I really like to do is kind of bring people together and try and facilitate discussion around what is the biggest issue of our time, climate emergency, and try to generate appropriate response to that as a built environment. Because I think quite a lot of us in the room will probably resonate that you might be part of your own organisations or either within your office or wider afield that are doing really some fantastic work towards that goal. But quite often those efforts are siloed in your own areas and maybe they're not communicating effectively enough with other wider people across the city or the industry, the country. And I think really what we're trying to do, GIA, in our sustainability committee role, but also ACAN Scotland, is really try to bridge some of those gaps and create some linkages to allow us to kind of have these conversations, but in a much more open, discursive platform. So really that's kind of what tonight is trying to do, is bring all of us together with some really fantastic speakers. And then maybe use this as a kind of platform, a launch pad to continue these discussions forward. First of all, over to the Vic later on, but then also we're kind of really keen to maybe get a couple of follow-up events over the coming weeks and months that offer an open platform for anyone in the room to come along to and share their thoughts or ideas or ambitions or aspirations. But then also create a kind of coordinated platform across the many plethora of really fantastic climate-related groups across Scotland. You're from everything from ReEnergise to GIA to CEDA to BEST to ACAN, obviously, and many more besides, and really just try to create a platform for a sort of coordinated group to move forward. So I've got to hand you over to my colleague Glo, who will tell you a little bit more about ACAN and some more aspirations.
Thank you. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Kieran. As Kieran said, I'm here currently representing ACAN Scotland. If you're not part of ACAN Scotland, please join. We're not just architects, we're anyone who's wanting to join the movement is welcome. Our triple aim is to decarbonise, to look at all the things that people talk about, operational and embodied carbon and everything else like that for climate emergency, but also the second one is biodiversity regeneration. So right from the start, ACAN's already started talking about that. And the third one is cultural transformation. And that is really fundamental. Cultural, societal, and climate justice is, inherently linked with all the problems we're meeting currently. So with those triple principles, ACAN Scotland hopefully will do what Scotland can that ACAN UK can't quite do, for example, certain Scottish policies. I, from the very beginning, started ACAN Scotland, now stepped away, doing other things, come back and try to re-energise what we're going to do and ask for your help, your ideas and synergies to step forwards. I've created this sort of survey for you to fill in, what projects, what campaigns, what activities you might want to suggest, bring forward. We have already some suggestions from our Edinburgh lot last week at our ReEnergise event over there, and some of them saying about the passive regulations, about futures of materials in Scotland and UK-wide as well, about how we might help with the NPF4, puts into practice, and also the other side of how can we help organisations like Living Rent, give them built environment professional help so that they can tackle fuel poverty. So there's a wide range of suggestions already. Please add yours to it. There are ACAN funding pots available for projects that might need some funding, pots ranging from £250 to £1,000. So if you think you might need support monetarily, or if you think your idea might need people, time, or whatever, and gathering people, just fill in the form, get the QR code, and we're really hoping to get everybody involved. So the people taking ACAN Scotland forwards will be Rachel, Hannah and Daniel. So you will be hearing more from them after we've collated the survey results. And we're also, apart from holding events to take these ideas forwards, we will also be having a StuCan climate festival that will happen on the 11th of September. And I hope that everybody will also come and support either the setting up or re-energizing of all the students, which we very much need, all the younger folk, to put their voices forwards, to step forwards and help with our climate and biodiversity emergency. So thank you very much, and we'll be putting the QR code up afterwards as well. Make sure you fill it in. So without further ado, I'll ask Barnabas to start off our talk.
This fabulous device is apparently a microphone you can throw at the audience, which is a really superb invention. Thank you very much for a hugely generous introduction to the GSA and GIA for supporting this event, and to all of you for coming. It's lovely to see some old friends in the crowd, and a really superb occasion. Architecture can save the world. Our title might sound like Rayner Banham or Cedric Price, an attention-seeking overclaim. But unlike the pronouncements of those other two mouthy English men, in the context of climate emergency, ours is the literal truth. The building sector is currently the second largest global sector after electricity generation in causing the problem, at 37%. Our sector also has an enormous role in the other ecological crises. The built environment is the main reason why human-made stuff now weighs more than the total mass of living things on Earth. We can save the world, or we can make it uninhabitable. In the face of this scale of challenge, what can we individuals in this room possibly do to help? We are all tangled up profoundly in the fossil fuel world. Not just in how we travel, work, eat, and survive the winter cold, but in much more profound things, how we think, what we find beautiful, what makes us feel successful. And even once you overcome a lifetime's indoctrination into the wonders of our fossil fuel energy system, there are still limits to your agency. If you are a practicing architect, you are hedged in by clients, by budgets, by regulations, by your colleagues on the design team, and by the planning process. Even in the imaginary world of architectural education, we're failing to come to terms with the challenge. Far too many design studios continue to propose new buildings on empty sites rather than starting with retrofit, and to allow or even encourage the ecocidal norms of steel-reinforced concrete rafts, steel or concrete superstructure, plastic insulation, and aluminium and plastic claddings, which, as used to catastrophic effect in Grenfell Tower, are not only more flammable and more toxic than thatch, but even have a shorter design life than thatch, despite their exorbitant embodied energy and embodied carbon. What the hell are we doing? It's tough to survey the world we are part of, dominated as it is by greenwashing, denial, and inaction. What a shitscape. Congratulations to you on being here, on supporting ACAN Scotland, on managing not to close your eyes, stuff your fingers in your ears, and go la 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 to shut out the noise of what's happening. By facing up to climate crisis, you are doing the right thing, indisputably. This isn't a binary situation, disaster or salvation, but a sliding scale where every extra ton of CO2 we emit pushes us a little further towards disaster end of the spectrum, and every ton we save pulls us back a tiny bit towards keeping a livable planet. why should I try if China is still releasing emissions, is a stupid argument. It's like responding to the water company's sewage releases into English rivers by shitting in your own bottle of Evian. Our actions either harm or heal. After Florian and John have spoken, I'll come back to some practical things we can all do now that make a real and powerful difference. But first, let me introduce the ways in which we three feel that architectural history can do its own bit to help architecture save the world. We're collaborating on a book that's trying to do just that. The history of architecture, I argued in my last book, which I've got a few copies of if anyone wants one. I don't want to carry them home, so make me an offer. If you've got a tenner, hand it over, and if not, just have it. The food and fuel that people harness from their environment, energy, enables them to do anything at all. And in particular, architecture is one of our most energy-hungry activities and has been for as long as we've been doing it. For most of our species' history, we were hunters and gatherers, taking food and fuel from our natural surroundings and typically using them shortly after harvesting. Buildings were rarely more than what was needed to work with the energy system. So, in an extreme environment like the Ice Age steppe, where temperatures were far below what humans can survive unsheltered, people wanted to go there in the first place to chase energy in the form of mammoths and reindeer. They needed shelter in order to chase that energy, so they built themselves enclosures to keep in the heat energy of their bodies and their fire. And they built these shelters out of the energy leftovers. This is made of mammoth bones and reindeer hide. They even heated it by burning mammoth bones, which must have smelled unbelievably nasty. I shouldn't know what burning bones smell like. I promise it's a cooking thing, not a serial killer thing. Fertile farming societies represented a major shift in energy system. They had an impressive ability to reconfigure the land around, maximizing energy production. But they didn't disperse the resultant energy very attractively. Most people lived in poverty, badly housed and badly fed, for around 10% of the population to live much better, and to command the construction of enormous monuments. But even with their offensive labour inputs, the architecture of farming societies, grand and humble alike, has a lot to teach us. They avoided heat, because growing the plant matter to burn for it was slow and took up land that was needed for crops. They used stone more often than fired brick, wood rather than metal, and labour rather than heat. Since fossil fuels came into wide use, and in Britain that's from the 17th century onwards, the amount of energy available to humankind has vastly increased. A Victorian miner could extract 2,500 times more energy than a medieval farmer. Previously, labour was cheap, heat expensive, but from the rise of coal, cheap fossil heat has been pushing out labour and swapping it for cheap fossil heat wherever possible. And the effect is that today's architecture is spectacularly profligate by any historical standards in terms of heat inputs. That substitution is the story of the climate crisis. But this substitution is not inevitable or irreversible. The architectural past shows us how to build good buildings with local materials that require little or no heat processing and that will decay harmlessly at the end of their use. Buildings which keep you healthy while minimizing operational energy inputs. Add renewable energy and you have the setting for a very good life. The buildings in the book Florian, John and I are working on show this great substitution of human effort for fossil fuel heat in detailed action. Fuel is so much the most powerful force in shaping what gets built, where and how, that I've been proposing a correction to Sullivan's axiom that form follows function. Tell me, we are having an argument at the moment about the title of the book. Which is a better title, Form Follows Fuel or Architecture and Fuel, 14 Buildings from Antiquity to the Oil Age? Hands up for Form Follows Fuel. Hands up for architecture and fuel, 14 buildings from antiquity to the oil age. Okay, we'll feed that back to our editor.
Our editor actually rejected form follows fuel.
Yes, but she's been outvoted.
20 books, form follows something.
Yes, and then none of them as good. Whatever it ends up called, our book shows the way to some of the materials, processes, and design ideas we need to produce livable, functional, satisfying architecture for any climate and any local palette of low-carbon materials. Our book explores the unique advantage that architecture has over the other major polluting sectors. There was no aviation, no electric generation, and no car travel before fossil fuels. There was an immense amount of good zero-carbon architecture. So I'm going to hand over to Florian to talk you through the superb research he's been doing on the book that we've been working on, and then to John to talk about the fantastic work he's been doing on the nitty-gritty of getting from drawings to embodied energy estimates, and then I will come back at the end to draw things together.
What I'm going to present is part of this book, which is to be released in 2025. And the book builds on Barnabas's excellent architecture, which you can see here. And glimpses of this can be seen every Tuesday on X. In architecture, Barnabas makes the important point that due to fossil fuel, life in contemporary industrialized societies is so much more energy rich than at any time before in history, and that this is evident in our architecture. And by and large, this energy wealth has been a great boon in general and in architecture. Better hygiene, lower child mortality, higher thermal comfort, you name it, if it only did not come with the danger to our climate. So we are writing this book to raise awareness of the scale of challenge that is connected with decarbonization, particularly for architects. And we would also raise awareness of the principles of energy use in construction that have remained constant over a long period of time, and that we need to take into account in order to save the world. In this book, we analyze architecture in different fuel systems, different fuel regimes, both embodied and operational architecture. So we will come up with hard numbers for individual buildings. And these show the vast difference between architecture before the invention of, or before the widespread use of fossil fuel and after, but also the difference between architecture under different regimes, for example, oil or coal. And this is an epistemological challenge that brings us to the limits of what actually can be known. And not only because for historical buildings there is very poor documentation. Also for contemporary buildings, which are very well documented, there are numerous problems of calculations. Different databases, for example, give different embodied energy figures for a kilogram of steel. And there are very different ways of measuring. We don't have the time to get into that, but that will be a great part of the book, because the greenwashing that Barnabas pointed to is also related to different ways of calculating energy use or even more blurry carbon emissions. So since time is limited, out of these 14 buildings, I will briefly talk about two. One from a pre-fossil fuel, low-energy society in 20th century Scotland, and one from an oil-rich industrialized society in 20th century Russia. So note that this is not about two vastly different periods or even vastly different countries, because buildings similar to the Soviet one were built in Glasgow or Edinburgh at the time as well. The point I want to make is that fuel regimes are often connected with uneven development. Currently, large parts of the world are still pre-fossil fuel regimes, cooking with firewood and building without fossil fuel. And this is also cause for hope at some point, because one may imagine a scenario in which some of the society might directly transform to renewables rather than to coal and oil. The other point I want to make is that by contemporary standards, a Soviet panel block, or a Glasgow high-rise for that matter, is not considered a particularly luxurious dwelling. And yet it is vastly more energy expensive than any dwelling in a pre-fossil fuel society. Such stone-built, chimney-less houses have been built in Scotland for thousands of years. But this particular one follows a typology that became popular in the early 19th century, so it's not such an old typology. It was built around 1885 and occupied until 1965, and afterwards became a museum. So the Black House exemplifies the lifestyle of a low-energy society. Most materials are local and don't require transport, and almost all of them are recyclable. The only aspect that we will have to bracket out for a moment is that this lifestyle, this particular lifestyle, was actually built on a semi-fossil fuel, peat. But in other parts of Europe, similar buildings and lifestyles were based on firewood. It's a society that relied on subsistence farming, fishing, hunting, and only to a very small extent on trade. So similar to a lot of pre-modern societies around the world. So what are the characteristics of architecture in such a society? The two key principles. One was conserving warmth at all cost, keeping operational energy low. And the other one was avoiding high energy materials, including iron, brick, or glass that need large amounts of heat to be produced. The Black House is laid out for maximum conservation of warmth. It has double stone masonry walls filled with rubbles, and as you can see here, it has a well-insulating thatched roof. Domestic animals are kept in the byre, which is next to the living area. Note that the roof beam is slanted so that the warmth from the byre can come over here to the living area. And the consumption of the hearth fire is the main use of energy. It's used for cooking, and next to tallow candles, it was the only source of light after sunset. People were living in extended families and often sharing beds, as it is the case in most low-energy societies. The lack of a chimney keeps the warm smoke under the ceiling and provides additional heating. So a chimney generally improves indoor air quality, but it comes with big heat loss. So whenever energy is very, very scarce, chimneys are being avoided, so the smoke just filters through the thatch. Warmth is actually also the main advantage of this location. What? Scotland? Warm? Well, actually, it is warm compared to winters in Central Europe, where you would have long periods of frost. So on the Western Isles, the cattle can graze throughout most of the year. So you have an almost 12-month vegetation period. And that was attractive enough to make people endure the downsides of Scottish climate: constant wetness, high winds, and very dark winters. So let's have a look at what the Black House does not use. It does not use any high energy materials. It does not use mortar for the simple reason that mortar is made from lime, And lime requires heating, and heating is a huge energy expense. The building uses very little metal, only the absolutely indispensable parts, basically the chain to hang the pot on, and nails for the truss. Even the door hinges were made of wood. And this is a thatched house, so in the high winds on Louis, this needed a net to keep the thatching on the roof, because otherwise, the hurricane gales would basically blow it off. And even that was traditionally made from homespun ropes and not from wire. For the same reason, the building doesn't have glass windows. And the building also uses very little wood. Trees are rare on the Western Isles, and wood requires energy to transport. In some black houses, actually, the roof joists were made from whalebone. Iron was possibly the most energy-expensive material in pre-modern societies, because it required a huge amount of heat to produce, and processes in past centuries were more wasteful than now. Look at a 17th century iron production. You would need approximately 40 kilograms of wood for 1 kilogram of iron. So a 5-kilo chain needs about 200 kilos of wood, and possibly the same amount for forging. Huge expense. And the same applies to glass. It even has a much worse rate of wood for glass, and this is mostly because of the need to produce potassium. And just imagine the work to cut, saw, and transport all those large trees by hand. So this is actually very different from popular imaginations of pre-modern houses. This example here is clearly from a fairy tale. It's just too expensive to be true. You have to be a gold mining dwarf in order to afford this without fossil fuel. 2 stories, large glazed windows, lighting behind every window, and a wasteful chimney. The real pre-fossil fuel dwelling actually is very economical with regard to embodied energy. The building only required slightly over 3 kilowatt-hours per square meter to build. So with a family of 5 adults, it could have been built in less than 3 months, and that was possibly the case. What about the operational energy? We already mentioned that the Black House was based on semi-fossil peat, which is abundant in the area. But it still was used economically because it requires a lot of work to cut and carry. So one principle was only 1 fire per household. And to keep 1 fire burning every day from dawn to bedtime, this requires approximately 2 tons of peat per year, which is what the Arnold Black House Museum is using. So we are talking about approximately 82 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. The Soviet panel block, and we look at this one in Ulica Grimau, number 14 in Moscow, is very, very different, characteristic for an oil-rich industrialized society. This is actually an experimental building. It's a prototype that was developed as a model for millions of others. They're called Khrushchevki, Khrushchev-era buildings. And they're not that different from panel buildings erected in many Western countries or buildings, tower blocks from prefabricated parts in the West. This prototype is a 4-story walk-up. So a 3-room family for a 3-room flat for a family of 4 has 60 square meters. And it's comparatively small 2-bedroom terraced house has the same. And the Black House actually, with 70 square meters, is approximately the same, but just that the Black House dedicates about more than half of this area to animals and to storage. So this was pretty generous against the standards of the time because the average Soviet citizen at the time had little more than 6 square meters. So that's actually more or less what the average black house dweller had. So the size of 2 beds. Both of them would actually spend most of their time outside. The building was erected from reinforced concrete panels that were prefabricated. They were used for both ceilings and walls. Interior walls were load-bearing and the exterior walls were hanged on them. They were actually only 16 centimeters thick, which leads to great heat losses compared to a traditional brick building or even to a black house. Some Soviet panel buildings used steel frames, but this one used more concrete simply because in the early post-war period, the Soviet Union did not have sufficient steelworks. But the architects did not care about large numbers of oil needed for concrete production and for heating bad insulation. So it was basically about substituting one form of high-energy construction, brick, with another one, concrete. Notice how brick, which was once the low-labor but high-energy substitute for stone, this is what Barnabas mentioned, now became a precious material in the sense that it is used for ornamental purposes, like here in these ceramic ornaments. Panel blocks are often called cheap buildings, but the cost saving lies exclusively in the saving of labor for production and assembly, because it takes less labor to produce a brick panel, a concrete panel, than a brick wall. And in terms of energy, there's actually no saving, but rather the opposite is the case. Concrete takes a lot of energy to produce, and bad insulation causes extremely high operational cost. So in this respect, the panel block is a direct outcome of the availability of cheap energy from fossil oil. Our figures leave out many details, but they suggest that the building takes approximately 2,600 kilowatt hours per square meter of dwelling space, compared to a little more than 3 kilowatt hours for the Arnold Black House. So a huge, huge difference. So what about the operational energy? The Black House needs approximately 240 kilowatt hours per year for heating and hot water, which is 4 times as much as the Arnold Black House. So we are talking about 14,400 kilowatt hours per year for a small 60 square meters flat. And this is mainly because of bad insulation. Panels have a U value of 1.62. U value is the better, the lower, and the worse, the higher. And concrete panels insulate significantly worse than stick stone walls. The Arnold Black House has only 0.8 U value, and significantly worse than the legal minimum for exterior walls nowadays for new built houses in the UK. Just a comparison. If you were to produce this energy through sustainable firewood, sustainable meaning that you only take out as much as wood regrows so that there's no risk for deforestation, you would you would need approximately 4,000 square meters to get this energy for a family of 4. So that's more than half of the size of a standard football pitch. And it doesn't really seem much, but calculated for the 12 million people who live in Moscow, and you will get 12,000 square kilometers, which is half the size of Wales. And this is based on only a very small calculation of 15 square meters per person. 15 square meters. Currently, the average UK citizen has about 38 square meters of dwelling space. And it does not yet include the energy that is needed for chopping and transporting the wood. The good news, panel blocks can easily be upgraded, and it's much easier than single-family houses, simply because one building houses a lot of people. And they can be equipped with additional wall insulation, triple-glazed modern windows, and other devices that save energy. So a study from East Germany has calculated that for this standard socialist house, this would reduce in energy consumption reduced by 75%. So in order to be sustainable, our buildings have to become more like the Arnold Black House. Not in the sense that we have to share beds or that we have to keep cattle next to our living room, but to learn from the principles. The principle to conserve warmth in a cold country such as Scotland. Obviously, in a hot country, it's the opposite. You need passive devices to keep the warmth out, and to restrict the use of high energy materials. And now John will take over and talk about the calculations and about the issues that are involved in them.
So thanks, Florian. So now, I'm not a historian, I'm an architect, and I've somehow found myself involved in this project. But really, it's how did we come to that 2,600 kilowatt per hour per square metre rate of embodied energy in the panel block, and how, as architects, we can feed in and look at history from a different perspective and use our skill set and what we're doing today in terms of modern energy and carbon within buildings, and look at the past and see what we can draw from them and be a bit more rigorous with it, and then instead of just saying, yes, well, of course that was it, we can actually prove it. So just picking up from Florian, looking at the Moscow panel block house, first of all, you have to look at the information that we had, and really you're looking at this element here, sort of article written, a lot of written documentation, plans, dimensions, and it's really taking that information and then trying to gather it and measure it. And how should we do that as architects? Well, we can redraw it, we can remodel it, we can analyse it and really scrutinise how the building goes together and how we might be able to create a model that we can take those volumes off of, those areas of materials. We can then create a set of drawings, set of information from that, and that gives us a representation of what the building was, but is now within our control. And from that model, we can really look and analyse that. And the sexiest thing ever is always a spreadsheet. And looking at it in detail and doing the calculation, really starting from what we do, looking at carbon in a contemporary sense, but going back and measuring the quantities of the material that we can do from the information we have at hand related to the historical research from it. Once we've got that, you can, it's a bit blurry here, but we've grouped all the measurements of all those elements by material. So the top column is the concrete. Now, the panel block house is very simple and useful because it's a series of repeated elements. So there isn't actually a lot of panel blocks there, it's all very standardised. But we can take that and from a redraw, a remodel of it, we can get a volume in metres cubed. And then from a density factor, we can then figure out the weight of that, a kilogram weight. And then from a variety of different historical sources, we have the energy of kilowatt per hour per kilogram it required to make that a kilogram of that material at that time period. Now, with a panel block house, we're looking at modern period. And then we take that kilowatt per hour per kilogram and times it by our weight to get each embodied energy of each individual element that makes up that building. And then he times it by the quantity. And then you do that for every bit of material that we know about, or that from the information we can actually quantify and categorise. And that's how we sort of are able to do that. Now, the panel block one was very sort of simple because it has a repeated form. But what about another project, another building? So as Florian sort of touched on, there's a wide range of the 14 that we were sort of looking at. This one is the Ford Moore Company Highland Park factory from 1908 to 10 by Albert Kahn. And can we then replicate what we've did with the panel block throughout all of these and really look at it? And you can see this one sort of picked at the dawn of the 20th century, looking at that concrete frame, brick, some strip classism on the south, but really full glazing to the north. Example of a factory building system there that sort of came to dominate in the 20th century. For this example, we had great information actually. Florian was able to source a full set of drawings, and that's where the sort of expertise of being an architect comes in, is we can really scrutinise that and scrutinise the construction of it and look at it in more detail and more precise detail. So you can see the scale of the building here, but zooming right in, I think that original sheet was the size of 2 A0s or something, at least the PDF size was, but we can zoom right into what the external wall build-up was and look at how this building was constructed. So we had great information for this building in terms of the size of columns, the depth of the brick, the size of the glazing, and the overall size of the floor plate. And we had a great set of details as well about the foundation and the substructure, so we were able to really go in and hone in on those volumes of it. And then you take that building and you convert it and you redraw it. And something that I've found doing this is there's a lot of overriding dimensions on hand-drawn, but once the dimensions don't tie up with what they measure as. And also there's different things of the scan obliques it, so there's a bit more of craft and workmanship and actually figuring it out. It isn't just a straight redraw, you have to actually analyse it and use your brain, which is painful sometimes. But what you're able to do then is to create a full set of drawings. And that's what we've tried to do with each and every individual building that we've analysed in this way, really scrutinise it and look into it. And it throws up some interesting things because you look at the outside of that Ford factory and it looks like a big rectangular box, which it is, but every building has its nuances. And you actually start to really reveal the building and the history of how that was built by really looking at it in detail. One of the things that I found interesting was when you start looking at it, the columns gradually decrease in scale as they go up every floor. Now, this is for structural efficiency, but it's also probably cost as well, but it's also important for us when we're trying to calculate an embodied energy, because the bottom column is almost 3 times the amount of material and embodied energy as the top column. So it's about that idea of being honest and being specific and really looking and going into the detail of it. And I think that's where, as architects, we can provide that and really read and scrutinise things. Another thing that I couldn't figure out for a while was I was actually looking at these 2 original cross-sections that we had. One's a cross-section and then one's a section through a loading bay on the east facade. And when you see the roof scape there, I was wondering for a long time what was going on because I couldn't really figure it out. Well, it meant that every 4 bays, the roof sloped into a slump there, all because Albert Kahn, having a classical education, wanted to keep a nice, clean parapet line all the way around his building, even on his north facade. So he created this very bizarre roof structure on the top that you would never see from the bottom, from the street view of it. And it's things like that that start to reveal themselves. But again, having to take in that extra material for the roof as it slopes there as well. And again, from the model that we sort of create and look at, we can then really bring in everything that we look at there. And you can see here a little bit more work than the panel block system in terms of the amount of things that start to get itemised and listed out. And, looking at that, just the column example, you might say, oh, well, it gets thinner, but when you times that over 168 times on the floor, it actually builds up to a lot of, operation and a lot of embodied energy in terms of concrete use and reinforced steel use within that. And also, the drawings themselves reveal little things like the tank not in this contract. So obviously, an architect saying, I've got nothing to do with the water tank, that's obviously in a M&E guy's package. So it's really the drawings tell a story of the building, and it's sort of interpreting that in a bit of archaeology, but also reading into it and, you know, being precise with it in terms of the calculations. In terms as well, sometimes assumptions are not always what we assume. We looked at the Li Yong typology from Shanghai from 1928 to 38, assuming that Shanghai at that time was going through an energy boom and using a lot more high energy embodied materials. And when you look at the typology here in this photo, it would appear to be a brick and concrete building and streetscape, sort of amplified by how much energy and wealth and your growth Shanghai was going through at that time. And again, we have good information, survey information from the time, drawn on the 24th of December 1928. So whoever drew that was obviously trying to get it done before Christmas. But when you look at that, you really look at it and go, well, that's a brick building. And when you look over a standard 14 bay standard sort of street layout, it gives off the impression of being a very high energy using building with brick everywhere and tiles for the roofs. But when you look at the cross section of it and you really start to analyse how the building was constructed, you can see that this central section here is all lightweight timber frame and is actually a very traditional Chinese housing typology that's wrapped by high energy using materials at the front and the back. At the back for the kitchen, probably for fireproofing and utility, and at the front, probably as a sign of wealth and a sign of show, as this is the new material or a bit of durability. So it's again challenging looking at those details and reading into drawings and not just assuming, and that's where it really comes into it. And again, taking that and doing the calculation set for it. And it sort of proves that although our assumptions were that maybe Shanghai this time was sort of equal as the European and American counterpart cities, in terms of energy use and material use, it probably wasn't in comparable typologies with Europe and America. So you might say, well, that's all very good, but what's the point? And I think the point is, and what's great about what Florian and Barnabas are doing, is that, you know, looking at history through the lens of this embodied energy and how we might actually start to even try to think of quantifying it. Of course, there's limitations to it. We can only quantify the information we know. The figures that we have are sort of generic. They're not specific to a building type in here, you know. So we have to, you know, be honest about that. But it does give us an opportunity that where we can compare potential buildings in history, can we learn something from that? And sort of three that can or might be able to be comparable in terms of typology and construction would be, you know, London Townhouse from the 1720s, Glasgow tenement from the 1890s, and Berlin tenement from the 1890s. And what was interesting about this is we're so used to talking about buildings and comparing buildings in terms of their plan layout and their spatial layout and placing them within their political and economic and cultural contexts, that I think we now have to also add the energy use into that conversation as part of our standards, our lexicon, or our dialogues about these. And, you know, also is equal as important as style and what the building looks like, and probably even more important from it. So what can we glean by looking at these three buildings in detail using the same sort of methodology that we've looked at the other ones? Well, we can sort of say, you know, even though they use the sort of base, same constructional principles, and that as society progressed during the 18th and 19th century, really the energy use went up from the typology like the London Townhouse to the Berlin tenement, even though improvements in manufacturing and glass got better and the embodied energy came down for it. But it was the introduction of iron supports for stairs, more brick supports to create more massive buildings, and showing that as society progressed in wealth and energy use, so did the buildings reflect that. But also then looking at then the Glasgow tenement, which replaces a lot of the brick and is comparable with the Berlin tenement, only uses half of the embodied energy to create it. So is that something we can glean from using natural materials over high energy materials in a proven way now, in a demonstrable way? And you can see there, again, listing out everything that we've sort of looked at and giving it a quantity and quantifying what we know. And, you know, that's really what we can sort of do as architects, is we have this great set of skills, you know, to read, interpret, reproduce, measure and model existing buildings like the Glasgow tenement. And, you know, this allows an exploration of historic buildings in a new and increasingly relevant ways in some respects that we can quantify with qualifications, of course, the embodied energy of buildings, and provide a new way that we can discuss the past of the built environment, glean new insights, hopefully inform ourselves of how a way to go forward. And, you know, what's great about the project is we've only touched on a variety of the buildings that we're looking at and a variety of the stories behind those buildings as well. And the amazing thing Florian and Barnabas is doing is opening that dialogue in terms of discussing energy and climate impact and environment, you know, the way we do with contemporary buildings, but from a historical point of view. And so hopefully by analysing the past of architecture in this way and adding this to the standard language that we use to discuss buildings from a historic point of view, you know, we'll become more aware of the challenges and impacts that we have, and who knows what we might learn by drawing from history. So I will hand back over to Barnabas.
You can tell the quality of precision and attention to detail of the other two collaborators is maybe even greater than mine. It's been such a pleasure and an excitement to follow Florian and John's fabulous work on this book, which has added so much precision and rigour to the story sketched out in my last book. You can see why I'm dumping the old copies on anyone I can. And what the book reveals or confirms is that despite so much effort by so many people to improve the environmental performance of our buildings, we are actually still squarely bang in the middle of the architectural age of fossil fuelism. Our new buildings worldwide are in the same family as the Georgian house or the brutalist high-rise or the Corb villas, substituting fossil fuel heat for labour everywhere they can and chasing stupidly high levels of amenity far beyond what we require for a happy, healthy life at enormous carbon cost. But what can you do about it? At architecture school, we pretend that you have enormous agency over what gets built, but we all know now that you're in practice that it's not true. What can you do in the face of all the forces pushing you to do the wrong thing, to default to concrete, steel, aluminium, plastics, and over-specified HVAC systems? Well, firstly, you can make a real serious difference by being honest. Do not greenwash. If you tell your colleagues or your clients or the public that concrete is basically fine because you're using some GGBS, or that a high rating from BREEAM or LEED means that the building is innocent of environmental harms, then you are taking personal moral responsibility for that lie and the emissions that come from it. If, on the other hand, you tell them honestly and accurately and undogmatically what their options are for truly reducing emissions, and what each option will cost, either in financial terms or in terms of amenity and functionality, then if the client goes for a high carbon option, it's totally on them. You've done what you can. Giving clients or the public a false sense that architecture is already responding adequately to our ecological crises is perhaps the most harmful thing that anyone can do. Any architectural practice, distinguished high-profile architect, developer, or sustainability evaluation system that gives a false impression of progress is actively conspiring with climate change, throwing its weight behind the greatest wrong ever committed by our species. Conversely, spreading understanding of the impacts of architecture and what can be done to genuinely reduce them is invaluable and powerful. ACAN does it brilliantly, avoiding culture war and rhetoric, establishing reliable facts, then communicating them clearly, accurately, and honestly. If you haven't joined ACAN Scotland, please do so and get involved actively. The second thing I'd love to urge you to consider doing is a sort of longer project that I'm sure many of you are embarked on already. We are collectively, as people bothered about the climate, asking people to change their values and their worldview in order to avoid disaster. We're expecting them to abandon the lifelong pressure on them psychologically for fossil fuel definitions of success. More exotic holidays, more powerful cars, bigger, warmer houses, faster phone data, more and more and more stuff. We're expecting them to abandon these long-held longings and priorities because we show them a graph. It's madness. It's not persuasive. We need to make zero carbon irresistibly attractive. My last book traced how architecture not only responds to changes of energy system, but actually becomes a major agent of energy change and cultural change. Le Corbusier, Mies and co. were so impactful because they made the new energy system of concrete, cars, electricity, steel, aviation into completely compelling architecture. So far, most buildings making ecological claims are modernism in a puffer jacket, or in this case, in unconvincing camouflage. They still chase an aesthetic of big windows, of clean lines, of looking new forever. Architects can produce a compelling new aesthetic for each climate and each palette of local, low-carbon materials, an architecture of retrofit, of summer shading or deliberate harvesting of winter sun, an architecture of dirty lines and characterful aging, where periodic low-carbon patching and repairs convey and document in the building the respect and care that centuries of owners have shown for the building. Architects can show that effective climate response will not look like our current lives, but shorn of many of our great pleasures, but rather our lives will be very different in a zero-carbon world, but could be very good. We could keep the hygiene and medical improvements of the fossil fuel world, but run them on renewables. We could spend less time commuting through traffic, trapped in a car, and eating shit microwave food because we haven't the puff by the time we finally dragged ourselves home to cook something nicer after a day of pushing hard at a largely pointless job in order to scrape together the rent that comes so expensive thanks to the fossil fuel overheated housing market. Who's clinging on to this shit? One of you isn't. In a zero-carbon world, we could have more time doing mindful things with our own hands, more time outdoors, more seasonal variation in food and living conditions. At the moment, most people live and work in conditions so artificial, like this room, that the weather is just an occasional nuisance. As the brilliant Lisa Heschong argues in this book, which I hope you're aware of and read, living seasonally with little heating and active transport, the seasons are a great joy. The arrival of spring is this huge happiness. And even the return to winter is a cozy, soporific huddling in with comfort food and loved ones and the cat. At the moment, fossil fuels ensure that the electricity to power our never-ending to-do list is permanently abundant. There is never a natural pause. With a transition to 100% renewables, the intermittency of supply can pause our labours and send us off to read a book or have a drink with a friend. At the moment, almost no one truly wants to make the changes required to save the world. But if you as architects can imagine and design a good life based on the realities of life after fossil fuels, leisured, humanly high-quality life, and can imagine and visualize for us the characterful, complex built environment that will house it, if you can make people see and believe in the better world arising from appropriate climate action, then you can truly save the world. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, both, all three of you. That was fantastic. We were watching a talk at work the other day, and it was a discussion with George Monbiot, and someone said that he was saying he always got derided for being an idealist, and he was like, well, of course I'm an idealist because I want the future to be better than it is today. And I don't think you get into architecture without a degree of idealism, so I hope that everyone enjoyed that. Amelia is going to facilitate a bit of a panel discussion with our speakers, so we want to sort of invite questions, and we'll come around and pass you microphones. We'll do that until about 15:15, and then we'll head over for some drinks. So I'll let you kick off.
Yeah, that's the plan. I'm hoping some of the back rows are going to have questions, so I have an excuse to throw this box machine. Okay, amazing. So yeah, thank you so much. I think it's really easy in all of those discussions always gets a little bit depressed how we have to save the world, and I guess like through the history and through all those buildings you showed that so far it's true, we haven't been too responsible. I'm guessing, are you guys really quite pessimistic? And maybe to open a discussion, if you have to choose a building today that would represent like our nowadays, what that building would be, and it's really, do you see the situation quite as grim? And what is the most modern building that you've chosen for your book so far? How far do you go on that?
Well, the most modern building that we chose for our book is a rather pessimistic one, which is the Kuala Lumpur International Airport, which was built on this idea that you would have supersonic flights that would get you from Los Angeles to Kuala Lumpur in 3 hours, and from there you go into smaller flights, and the annual whatever amount of annual like passengers in Kuala Lumpur Airport was thought to be about 20 million per year in a country. Well, it was basically a multiple of the inhabitants of Malaysia at the time. So.
Okay, so it's fair to say that the future is quite grim in your book.
Well, we are looking in the last chapter at some examples of architecture that is more energy saving, but probably Barnabas can say more about this.
I think I'd like to take that question in a more general direction, which is that I think the present is very grim, but I don't think we know what the future's like yet. And to some extent, events like this are actually a significant chance to change the future, because when change happens in human affairs, human beings are part of nature, and natural change is exponential, not linear. And so small changes in the way that people do things rapidly spread to be something much, much bigger. And it's why the honesty point is so massively important, because a huge proportion of the population believe hoardings that say this building is sustainable, where you can see the concrete mixers churning and pouring over the top of the hoarding and the steel frame going up, and the public don't know. And why should they know? It's not their field, it's our field, and we need to tell them. Because when people, if you start, for example, taking a cold shower every day to save the carbon it takes to heat the water for your shower, you can save all the carbon it will cost to replace the Marks and Spencers on Oxford Street with the proposed replacement that sadly looks like going ahead at the moment, you can save that 40,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide by taking daily cold showers if you take daily cold showers for just 680,000 years. And once you know that, if you've been taking cold showers and having a horrible morning every morning to save energy, and you suddenly find out that some shit is building 40,000 tonnes worth of unnecessary replacement shop, it makes you push for change extremely strongly. And buildings are a really easy place for us to turn a lot of this around. They're one of the biggest emitters, one of the easiest places to fix it, not at the level of you operating as architects, but at the level of political change and public opinion change. So I'm very optimistic that we can fix it, and I'm unclear at the moment where the culture war is going to mean that 48% or 52% of the population decide to fight incredibly aggressively with false information and madness on Twitter against it. At the moment, that's the way it's going, and therefore we also need to do what ACAN is very good at, of not bundling this together with other issues in a way that alienates anyone. Keep it clear, keep it single issue, focus and get change on that most important issue.
Maybe on the back of this, we obviously won't save the world by just taking cold showers. But if you look at history, it actually changes in architecture have happened comparatively quickly. So we're talking about a few decades, and each of these changes also has been a question of choice at many individual levels. So there is hope that such a change could also be triggered now.
So it's fair to say that we're quite negative about now, but we're quite optimistic about the future.
We could ask John as a practitioner about not asking the secrets of the usher practice.
I don't have any answers. But I think what's interesting for me is certainly looking back from what the situation is now and not knowing what we know now because it was known back then. But when I started university, everything that was associated with green was complete greenwashing. It was entirely greenwashing. And that was what was getting taught, as if that was what your sustainable building was going to be. And I think we're all now more educated. We're all now actually know the truth. And in my time in practice, what we've seen is actual change in the industry. Now, I don't think it's enough. I think we're still doing business far too much as normal. We're still pouring concrete slabs. We're still using metal cladding. We're still doing all of this and it's all accepted. We're still using oil-based membranes. It's all still there, but we're trying and we're educated, and we're more educated than we've ever been, I think, as an industry. And we are pushing it in all different respects, in all different fields. And I think the next big change hasn't happened yet, but that's what the great challenge and the great opportunity we have. Probably not my generation, probably the generation of younger people here in university now are going to pick up on that, and hopefully they will change the world or change architecture for the better. And I think seeing that change in the industry, even though, sometimes it might be face value, sometimes it has been real change, but it is happening now. So it gives me optimism, but I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think we're all on the same page, and it's preaching to the choir. I think here everyone is probably agreeing with everything we've heard so far. So maybe this is a good moment to open to the public questions.
I've got so many questions and so many things I want to say that it's impossible to know where to start. I think one of the best things that was said tonight, and something that I think that everybody here needs to take into account, is that it is the small things and the measuring that is important. Not the vilification of certain types of buildings, not the vilification of certain practices. Concrete is not the enemy, believe it or not. I'm a historian, I've got a master's in sustainability, but longevity is something we haven't really talked about. Longevity of buildings. We build buildings for 50, 60 years. If we change how we make concrete, if we change how long it lasts. You know, we've discovered Roman concrete formulas. We've lowered the CO2 in concrete, I believe, in certain concrete practices by quite a lot. I know you're disagreeing with me, Barnabas. I can see your face. However, it's what you said about it's the small things and the measurements, and we need to push for policy change, because nothing will change without policy change. And I think that's genuinely, so sorry that wasn't so much a question, but I too am looking into this stuff and lecturing on this stuff, and you know, it's too easy to turn around and say, this is good, this is bad. But everything that's done by you guys, not by me, I just get to talk about it, but everything that's done by architects needs to be now measured, understood, and needs to be thought not just in terms of how much carbon's going in, but how long it's going to last, and whether it's a good building that will last a long time. I think that's something that I really want to say. And retrofit first, for God's sake.
We agree on the end point. Longevity is a really slippery argument because you can't count on the building not being demolished entirely unnecessarily within the 60-year cycle, which is the current norm. And at that point, you could have built it to last 10,000 years and all that extra carbon is just dead. But also, the scale of the speed that we have to turn this round at means that this needs to be an emergency action, not a kind of, you know, if we'd started in 1968 saying, okay, let's build durable buildings and keep them and retrofit them, and then we'd actually done it, then fine. But we're not at a point where a 60-year payoff is any use at this point. What we need is to cut the upfront cost radically. We're currently doing the thing people do where they buy something very expensive for their house and say, well, on cost per use basis, it'll end up cheap, and then they break it anyway. And we're doing that with carbon, and we can't afford to. We've got to cut the upfront now, mostly by retrofit, which is good news for architects, incidentally, because it requires a lot of design activity to do retrofit, and design activity that can't be offshored because you need to go and look at the building a lot, whereas all the kit-built shit that's insanely carbon intense can be designed by anyone anywhere on Earth, and doesn't really need to be designed much by anyone in the first place.
I think just very quickly, my last point was being the whole sort of designing only for operational energy is such a problem, and it's so short term. And as I said to Barnabas earlier, I might have had a bit of a rant at the wrong person that re-asked last week about exactly this thing, because that's what we're pushing. Short-term architecture that is operational energy only, and then in 20, 30 years' time, when we decarbonise the grid, you know, it's still full of foam and plastic. Not good at all.
I mean, just in response to what you mentioned before, if concrete is the enemy or not, I think I fully agree with Barnabas about being honest is the first step. Concrete can be the lesser evil in a lot of contexts. For example, in the global south, countries that are facing deforestation, where you simply don't have any low carbon alternative, but it shouldn't be a justification of using it in contexts where you do have an alternative. So it is about being aware what you're doing and not looking the other way.
I guess picking up on that retrofit first point, one of the things we keep finding is that, I know this is a policy point people have spoken about, but the VAT on retrofit makes it unaffordable for so many groups who would rather retrofit than build new. But we're seeing so many people making the choice to build new because they simply can't take that 20% uplift. And I don't know where we go with that beyond shouting loudly, and hopefully a change of government might lead to a change of policy. But I don't know what the thoughts are on that.
I'm not engaging with that question in any way, but the JCB is the largest sponsor of the Tory party year after year after year. That's a total non sequitur.
I guess, like, coming back to my previous comment, it'd be really, really nice if we could see a retrofitted building, one of the buildings that you represented in your book, retrofitted, brought to the current standard as a building of our generation and of our age. I guess, like, that would be my dream, to bring the retrofit as a representation of my generation. We have another question. Yeah, there we go.
I'm going to speak into this box. This is a very, very, very strange experience. Thank you so much. I really loved your talk. It was brilliant. I look forward to having a pint there. I just wanted to ask quite a general question, I suppose, because I'm really interested in the retrofit thing as well, and I can understand how the work that you've done helps us understand how to build buildings, new buildings in a better way. What does the history of architecture tell us about how to do retrofit?
Tells you that anyone without fossil fuels retrofits first as an absolute default measure. So if you look at something like the Mausoleum of Hadrian in Rome, it was built as by a very energy-rich emperor as his massive mausoleum. And then after no one cared about him anymore, it was converted into a fortress to defend the Pope in times of trouble. And it operated as that for hundreds of years, and now it's a tourist attraction and religious site of pilgrimage, and it operates as that. It's the same stones in each of these functions, but totally different meanings and functions being given to the same stones, because it doesn't really matter what you use something for, so long as you keep the stones in place. And that's the standard attitude of the pre-fossil fuel world. Deliberately destroying a building is either indispensable or a major gesture in earlier periods.
There wasn't even a word for retrofit in most contexts, actually. It was just a normal practice.
Hi, I loved your previous book, Barnabas. It talks a lot, I think, about societies flourishing when they have lots of energy and kind of falling when they have less. We're hopefully going to we'll have a new government, one way or another. What would all of your suggestions to them in terms of energy policy be?
To be courageous about it and do the right thing. They'll get voted out at some stage anyway. They need a massive campaign of communicating why as well, which includes depoliticizing it and making it clear that this is a problem that's going to affect people and is already affecting people, whatever their economic position and so on. It needs to be clear that it's not some kind of left-wing conspiracy, which is terrifyingly where it's getting pigeonholed. And then you decarbonize it as aggressively as you possibly can. And face the complexities of that and try and help the people who are rendered jobless by some sectors shrinking to move into sectors that need to grow.
I mean, let's be clear, the construction industry is the most, or among the most regulated sectors of society. So it shouldn't be that difficult to change the regulations in a way that they actually suit the goal of saving carbon.
And I hope there's no contractors here, but contractors will only do stuff if they have to do it. So we need the policy change and we need that pushed through. So a couple of contractors in the room, obviously.
I hope there are contractors in the room. It would be great for contractors to get involved in ACAN.
We have another question, but I guess if we were talking about policies as well, consistency, because you mentioned we have a new government, and we say it every single time, we have a new government, and we always hope for better. What if we didn't have to wait for a new government for things to get better, consistency, I guess, would be the key. Another question? Yeah?
I love the level of detail in your analysis of the buildings. I'm sure as much detail as a QS would look through, so that was brilliant. I was just wondering, do we start changing how we view the value of buildings in terms of banks of embodied energy that already exist? And we should be maybe thinking about how much that building is worth in terms of how much energy it has, and that's the price that the building has on it. I don't know, I haven't quite thought through how that plays out, but it seems like where I'm living at the moment, there was beautiful big industrial buildings that were levelled for the sake of a new housing estate coming in, and masses of concrete and brick just disappeared over a matter of months, and some very interesting structures that could have taken on a new life because they were not seen as valuable banks of energy. So if we started thinking about buildings a bit differently, would that encourage more retrofit? This might already be happening, I don't know, but as someone who's also looking at investing in property and stuff like that, it doesn't seem to come into account how much energy has been taken to actually make the fabric of that building, and it's more about how many bedrooms you can squeeze into a property to make it valuable. So I just wondered what might
occur in the future if we start thinking differently about fossil fuels.
Yeah, and I think that looking at what existing buildings are worth in terms of their embodied carbon and their embodied energy is something we should be looking at seriously. And the problem is we are in this sort of vicious cycle, aren't we, where it's because energy is so cheap, it's less of a risk to demolish existing buildings than it is to investigate how we might retrofit them or fit them out and make them in a different use. And that's just because energy is cheap to demolish them and build new ones still. So I think, that would be a different, as in the case in history, where if energy wasn't cheap, you would look to reuse that building before you would ever think about demolishing it.
Well, again, that's a question of legislation, and obviously it's a hen and egg question, because if we value existing buildings more, there's more likeliness that we would push for legislation that taxes demolition to the extent that it makes it so expensive that retrofit is a cheaper alternative, and that's basically the only way how you would get eventually a sea change.
Last question.
Hi, it's kind of going back to the kind of idea of construction and contractors, but also about how we design for decarbonisation. And maybe an example would be like our trades can be quite different country to country. So like we're quite a brick laying sort of country as the United Kingdom, but examples in like France and further afield in their use of stone and like mass stone is like laying stone blocks like we do with our tenements like 100 years ago is like a bigger industry over in France, so they're able to kind of kickstart that again. And stone's obviously a little less carbon intensive. So is it about designing for the way that we build, so like beam and column, or is it about training our contractors up to be able to build in the way that we design?
Question about the vernacularity, really, and how do you see vernacular architecture in a modern context?
Yeah, I think that the level of change we require is too big to operate on the existing bank of skills exclusively, certainly, but also primarily. That when you look around for people who can do complicated insulation improvement to existing buildings, it's pretty hard to find people who've got serious experience of dealing with the massive difficulties of, where a Victorian wooden floor meets a brick or stone wall. And it's therefore wildly expensive and hard to do. And that's an entire industry that needs to come into being fast, and clearly needs subsidies. It clearly needs people to be helped across from the, very carbon-intense industries. People who are coming out of work in cement production need to start training in retrofit, and that needs centralised action of various sorts, I suspect, to make it happen. But I think the details of getting the employment market to fit round it are manageable once people genuinely want to achieve it. It's so much smaller than the changes we made to deal with COVID, let alone the changes we made to deal with the Second World War, that the country made to deal with the Second World War, and the challenge is so big by comparison with certainly COVID, that centralised action is something people support as soon as they understand the problem. And getting enough people to understand it to mean that we have a democratic mandate to push this stuff through with good faith, rather than just doing a kind of COP 782 set of, moving of goalposts.
So we have last question.
The question was about the increasing illegality of protest in Britain, and obviously it's catastrophic and totalitarian and disgusting and in every way harmful for all sorts of causes, but particularly given that the main stimulus for it seems to be people who genuinely and sincerely care about climate action. I think personally that there's a danger that organisations like Just Stop Oil play too strongly into the culture war splitting that I think is seriously unhelpful, though obviously the point they're making is right. I think ACAN's way of handling this as a kind of fact-driven, keep saying the facts, keep being courteous, keep negotiating, keep just saying what the truth is in a way that is as unobjectionable as you can make it. It's only the truth that's being objectionable is the right way to go and is much more powerful than the kind of divisive forms of protest. But getting the voice out there in any way that improves the chances of more people coming over to recognise the scale of what needs to be done and to really want the change is all to the good, and banning protest is just disgusting under any circumstances.
I mean, it's even more appalling if you think that what the protesters do is basically calling a government to action for goals that this very government has signed. I mean, we're talking...
That feels like a very poignant way to wrap up the discussion. I know we could talk all evening, but it'll be much nicer with a pint. So, yeah, go for it.
Just with that in mind, everyone's going to the pub and there'll be a lot of really interesting chat. We'll know that'll happen, but I just wondered if you could maybe kickstart that ball rolling with just a general question to the panel, just to finish on. Barnabas, your last sort of conversation there at the podium was very inspirational. Kind of the choose life rhetoric was almost evocative of train spotting. And you know, like the classic choose life quote. And in the same way as train spotting kind of like shone a light on heroin addicts in inner city Edinburgh, but a topic and an issue that not many people in society would have otherwise been aware of. Using that as a metaphor for this, what an open question to the panel, one-word answer, two-word answer. How do we get this message out to the masses? How do you shine that spotlight on the issues that we're talking about here? And how do we broaden this conversation outside this room to more people who are not of an architecture or built environment background?
I think you just have to tell people they've noticed what's going on with the weather here and everywhere, and that the world's getting weirder and climate's getting more disrupted, and especially in my own lifetime, I've seen things change. You know, I used to have white Christmases every year. Now you never have a snowed Christmas here in Scotland, and that's because the world's changing, and everyone can see that. You just have to open your eyes to it.
I think the killer thing is to quantify. As soon as London started making very big projects declare their embodied carbon, people started to kick off about it, because knowing that it's 40,000 tonnes and that a plastic bag that you don't get at the supermarket anymore is kind of 0.05 grams or something, and that therefore, you know, when you're staggering out of the shop with your shopping piled up on your arms, and someone else down the road is building 40,000 tonnes worth of embodied carbon of unnecessary swapping one shop for another. It's just sickening when you put figures to it. So put figures to it, make it compulsory, but in the meantime do it with your own work. Even if you can't publish the figures, work out the figures at least to a decent ballpark level so that you can discuss it and see where you can improve it, and include embodied energy in those figures, because embodied carbon changes every time the grid changes, and it's more susceptible to creative accounting by people who aren't of good faith and are greenwashing what they're doing. Embodied energy is an extraordinarily robust and comparable figure. So use it wherever you can and publicize it wherever you can, and people will see how big a difference it can make with so little cost to them as individuals, because very few people care if a developer can't double their profit on a building.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much, and thanks for coming, and hopefully we'll see you on the road. Thanks.